That's always a good sign, as is the little participants numbers that are coming into the room. I see you all in the chat, in the numbers. Welcome everyone to this evening's conversation, or this afternoon's conversation, or this morning's conversation, depending on where you are. I guess we can just say today's conversation, also whenever you might be watching this. You all get the pleasure of me blabbering for the next 30 seconds while everyone comes into the room. Want to make sure that everyone's able to join before we start. So hope you all have something warm or cold to drink, depending on the temperature in your space at this moment and the time of day, I suppose, too, as well. And yeah, we're happy to see everyone here this evening. All right, so we're going to get started. Yes, good to see you all in the chat popping up. I will be joining you in a minute after I do our introductions for this evening. I'm Katie Freeman, and on behalf of Mystery Writers of America, welcome to MWA University. MWA-U 2024 included 6 online classes taught by top-notch crime writers, and we have reached our final session. For now, a reminder that these classes have been free for current MWA members, and there's so much more that membership has to offer as well. So if you're not a member yet, consider this a very warm welcome to join. And now to introduce our presenter today. Sheri Lewis-Wohl is an award-winning writer who lives in Northeast Washington State, where she writes her stories of murder, mystery, and all things paranormal. While she has yet to actually encounter a vampire, werewolf, or ghost, she never stops looking for them when darkness falls and the full moon rises. A policy analyst, Sheri recently retired from the administrative office of the U.S. courts after a 3+ decades career with the federal judiciary, and is a former human remains detection K-9 handler with search and rescue in Eastern Washington and North Idaho. She and her K-9 partner deployed on missions throughout the Northwest. These days, Sheri continues to write her stories of dark, dangerous, and delectable characters, is working on running half marathons in all 50 states, and works with and trains her German Shepherds. In her spare time, whenever that might be, she acts in television, feature films, and theater, while also writing a play or two along the way. And I wanted to just spotlight that her newest book, The Guardians, is forthcoming on December 10th, coming up next month, and you can pre-order today. For our session, Sheri will be discussing forensics, or what does it take to search for dead people? From selecting the right dog to forensics education to training at Barty Farms, Sheri will take you through the realities of canine search and rescue, and specifically humans remain detection. So Sheri, please take it away.
Thank you, Katie. And thank you, everyone, for letting me come talk to you tonight. So basically, the Mystery Writers of America University has gone to the dogs, because here I am. And so we're going to talk about dogs, and I'm going to share my screen because I want to show you pictures as we go along. And let me get you set up here. And let's start from there. So we're going to talk about More Than the Nose and its canine search teams in the 21st century, because things have changed from what you might have seen in the past. And as Katie said, this is me. And I actually started my career with the judiciary as the financial administrator in Eastern Washington. Someone had asked if I was a judge, and the easy answer to that is no, I am not and was not. And I moved from the court here in Eastern Washington to the administrative office in Washington, D.C., and retired a little less than a year ago as a policy analyst. And again, I worked the dogs in both Spokane County and Kootenai County, Idaho. My partners, just so you know, I had an initial partner, Clancy, and he decided that he didn't really care for searching for people. So we let him come home and just be a dog. And then I started training with Zoe, who loved the work. She's certified in both land HRD, and land HRD includes searching in the wilderness, searching in buildings, searching vehicles. And she also did shoreline, and we'll talk a little bit more about these. She had a little back issue, had to go to Washington State University for surgery, so she retired a bit early in 2019. Then Deuce came along, and Deuce is fully trained in human remains detection. But last year, I decided to step away from search and rescue because of the commitment that it requires. And we'll talk about that some more too, because I think you might be surprised on what this all takes. And we did have a meeting, however, just so you know. I met with Deuce. I said, I would like to step away. Is that okay with you? He said, yes. So here we are, retired now. But I will tell you, if you come to my house and visit and park your car in my driveway, before he says hello to you, he insists on checking your car to make sure you have no dead bodies. So he's still on the job. So I'll get into actually working with the canines, and you'll notice Zoe here. We were working on four-wheelers that day, so she just happened to hop up there, and away we went into the forest. I want to talk about disciplines first and foremost, because when people talk to you about search and rescue, the sense is that you just have your dog and you just go out and do whatever it is they tell you to do. And that's actually not the reality of it. There are disciplines, and you must certify you and your dog, and it is a team certification, in the distinct disciplines. Air scent is the first one, which is wilderness. And this is what you see as live find. This is when a child gets lost, or your grandmother with dementia wanders off. The air scent teams are the ones going out there and finding them. But the thing about air scent teams are that they're not scent specific. So these dogs are trained to find anybody, which is why you don't use it in an urban setting, because there's too many people. In the wilderness area, if they find just a random hiker, not who you're looking for, you still reward the dog, tell them they did a good job, and then you tell them to get back to work, and they continue working until you find the person you're actually looking for. Trailing is what you see more in an urban area. And trailing is when you see the dogs on TV and they're on those long lines. That is a trailing dog. And they are trained to do that in both wilderness and urban areas. And they do a good job at that. Avalanche, that's pretty self-explanatory. These are the dogs that can find you in the snow. And it is fascinating to watch these dogs dig you out of the snow. Disaster dogs are like the FEMA dogs. And what's a little interesting about the FEMA dogs is that they're required to have a bark alert. So every dog, when they have found what they are looking for, give you what we call a trained response. And for the disaster dogs, the FEMA dogs, that trained response is a bark alert. And if they can't do the bark alert, they will wash out, because they don't want them doing a down. They don't want them doing a sit, because they can be on something very unstable. And so we actually had a FEMA washout dog on our team who refused to do the bark alert, but he was actually a fantastic search dog. He just wanted to do a down when he found what he was looking for. So we trained him for scent specific work, and he had a great career as a search dog. Firearms detection is relatively new in the search and rescue world, because usually these are dogs that are part of the police force. In Spokane County, they lost their federal funding for the firearms dog, and one of our teammates had a little rescued Malinois who needed a job, but she was not reliable off lead. And so they decided, hey, let's try her on firearms detection, because she doesn't have to be off lead to do that. We'll see how she does. And it turns out she excels at it. So she will find guns, casings, gunpowder, and works. She was the first search and rescue firearms detection dog in the state of Washington. And now you're seeing it pop up all over the country. She gets a lot of calls to ask her questions on how she does that. But tonight, what we're mainly going to talk about is human remains detection, or HRD, which is what I did for 11 years. And there is land HRD, which again, that encompasses vehicles, buildings, large areas. And then there's also water and shoreline. And I will get into the specifics on those as we go through this. But what makes us a good search dog? People come up to me all the time and would say, oh, my dog has a great nose. I think they'd be perfect for search and rescue. And first thing I'd say is, well, how old is your dog? And they say, well, 5. And you're like, nope. Because the working life of a search dog is relatively short, just because the life of the dogs are relatively short, you don't start a dog at 5, 6, 7 years old, because it takes a very long time to get these dogs trained and certified. And if they're an older dog, they are not going, their working life would be a year, maybe 2. And so in our area, the maximum age, and that's stretching it, to start a dog is 3. Most of the dogs are started at a year. But the biggest thing that you have to have in a search dog is drive. These have to be high drive dogs, which is why you see a lot of Malinois, German Shepherds, Border Collies, Labradors. They have phenomenal drive. They go, they go, they go, they go, they go. And that's what you're looking for. They have to be brave. We ask these dogs to go into tunnels. We ask them to climb ladders, go up on a roof, go into dark buildings. And if they don't have the nerve to do that, they're not going to make it. Toy drive, it seems silly, but it's critically important, because these dogs aren't working just because we asked them to do that. No, these dogs are working because at the end of it, they get a reward. And for the dogs, the majority of the dogs, it is a toy. Now, finding the specific toy that really lights them up can sometimes take a while, but that's what they're working for. And mine, both Zoe and Deuce, worked for leather tug toys. That was their big deal. And the thing about those particular toys is, the only time those dogs get to play with those reward toys is when they have successfully completed either a mission or a training exercise. Other than that, those toys are never touched by the dogs. So it makes them special and exciting. Again, they have to be persistent, because they can go for hours looking. They have to be independent, because they're not going to be Velcroed to you. You give that dog the command, and that dog is gone doing its job. Now, it may check in with you. Zoe in particular liked to check in with me all the time, but she also took off and was gone doing her job. To problem solve, because sometimes it's not simple. And one of the biggies is these have to be athletes. And that's because searches can take hours, or it can be 12 hours in one day and another 12 hours the next day. So they have to be able to continue working. And a biggie is they cannot be aggressive. They cannot have bite work done in their past. And that's because search dogs are around a lot of people, and especially like an air scent dog going to find a child. You can't have an aggressive dog coming in on a child. And so these dogs have to have no aggression. We do a phenomenal amount of socialization with them. And again, if they've done any bite work at all, it's an automatic washout. They won't, well, not even washout. They just won't take them, period. So just because your dog has a good nose doesn't mean that dog is going to make a good search dog. So there are things that it's not breed specific. It is literally dog specific. Do they embody all these things? And if they do, well, then maybe you got yourself a really good search dog and you need to get to work. But it's not just the dog. We are a team. And so the handler has to have certain traits as well. And the handler and the dog work in tandem, which means you better be physically fit too, because you're going to be following that dog for all of those hours. For our team here, both in Idaho and Washington, we have to pass fitness tests yearly. And it's pretty simple, but it's a 30-pound pack and completing 3 miles in 50 minutes or less. That's the baseline fitness test. You have to have the ability to put in hours of training. And when I say hours, and I've got it, I know in one of the slides later, we're talking a minimum of 16 hours nose time per discipline per month. And every hour has to be documented. And that comes into play later too when we start talking about litigation and court work. There are academies. Most of the search and rescue teams have an academy that must be completed. In Spokane County, it's like 12 weeks long. Kootenai County, it's 12 weeks, like every Friday night, you go once a week. And in Kootenai County, they tend to cram it all into a Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, but those are very, very long days. There are FEMA courses you have to take. There are first aid, CPR, bloodborne pathogens, helicopter training, crime scene training. All of this has to be done, and some of them are a one-time class. Some of them require retakes every 12, I'd say every 2 to 3 years. And then a biggie, a really big thing is you have to be proficient with the GPS and compass navigation. GPS units are phenomenal, love them. And so I have a handheld that tracks me and a collar that tracks my dog on the same thing so we can see both of our tracks. But the compass navigation becomes critical as well, because what happens if your GPS fails? So you don't want to then turn into the person they're having to come search for. So you have to be proficient in these areas. And gear, you can see the list there. These are just a few of the things that you need to have. There's all sorts of other things as you go along. But the thing that I wanted to point out here, because this surprises people, is that all of these things are paid for personally. Now, the dogs are mine. I bought them, I feed them, I house them, I train them. All of that is on me. All of the gear that I use for the dogs, all of my own gear was paid for out of pocket. The counties that you work for do not buy you any of the gear. So it is not for the weak of heart to go into search and rescue, because it takes over your life and it takes over your checkbook. So just something I like to point out to people, because it does surprise folks when you tell them that. But let's talk about the dogs and what we actually do. So we got our dog picked out, we got our gear, we passed our tests. We're going to get out there, but how does the dog do it? And I like to say the nose knows, because they do. They work with their nose. And the simple way of kind of pointing out what they do is that when the dogs smell something, they get an entire story. And an example of that would be a plate of spaghetti. So if we had a plate of spaghetti in our hands, what we would smell is that lovely marinara. But what the dog smells is tomato, garlic, oregano, basil, Parmesan. They smell every individual piece of that plate of spaghetti. And that's what makes them phenomenal. Humans have 5 to 6 million scent receptors. So that's why we only smell marinara. The dogs possess up to 300 million. And that's what makes them so phenomenal at being able to find human remains. And I do want to say, well, I guess I'll do this next. Let me get here first. So when we talk about human remains detection, and this is the discipline that I worked in, even though I trained, Zoe actually trained in air scent, Deuce is trained in air scent. We never certified in it. Zoe was trained in trailing. She was phenomenal at trailing, but I never certified in it, because really this is where we did our best work. And I will refer to it as HRD, or human remains detection, although you hear over and over the term cadaver dog. And I hate that term personally. It's not totally inaccurate, but it doesn't give you the full story because it makes it look as though the dogs are only finding full bodies. And while that's true, we often are looking for full bodies and we often find them. It isn't the whole story. These dogs are trained to detect the scent of human decomposition. And that can be anything from a full body to a tooth to a finger to a dry bone. They can find all of those things. And so that's why I prefer the term human remains detection. We imprint them with the scent of decaying human remains. And why? Because we find the lost and provide closure to families. And this is probably the most important thing in my head. People would come to me and say, Sheri, what you do is kind of weird and it's kind of creepy because you're looking for dead people. And yes, we were looking for dead people. And I knew that when they called us out, because we were a recovery team, that the expectation is that this person is gone. And intellectually, I understood they were gone. Emotionally, it felt to me as though they were out there cold, lost, and alone. And so that's why it was so important to me to bring these people home to their families. And so that had a lot to do with why I stayed in that discipline for over a decade. We also assist law enforcement in missing person searches. And I mean, all of them technically, I guess, are missing persons. But what I'm getting at here is that these can be years old cases and they may have new information and they ask us to come in and search. And so we do. And of course, we do a lot of work in criminal investigations, which usually we can't talk about or even say where we're going. But we do a fair amount of assessment because law enforcement typically doesn't have the HRD dogs. They have patrol dogs, they have explosive dogs, they have narcotics dogs, but they don't have the HRD dogs. And so they rely on us to do that work for them. Now, how do we get the dogs there? We use training aids. And what are training aids? And that's what it's another one of those questions people always say, well, how do you train them to find dead people? And it's like, well, we kind of use dead people stuff to find dead people. And so in my garage, I had a dedicated padlocked freezer because you don't really want to combine your hamburger and steaks with human remains. And so this little freezer sat all by itself off in the corner, marked as biohazard in my garage. And inside it, you would find jars with human remains, including, just so you know, my own gallbladder. I had gallbladder surgery and I explained to the doctor what it is we do and could I please take it home? And he said yes. And so all the dogs in Eastern Washington and North Idaho have trained on my gallbladder. But you don't just get to have this kind of stuff. All of this is under the purview of the sheriff's office. It is inventoried with each one of those little jars inside my freezer had a specific number that identified it back to me. I had to do biohazard training so that every time we handled those remains, the handling procedures were standard and approved and safe. And so the other thing is there were unannounced audits. And so a sheriff's deputy might show up at your house and say, okay, let's check the freezer. And he'd take my list and check my freezer against my list and make sure everything was being handled correctly. So there's a whole protocol to it. And when I stepped away last year, then I signed over my freezer and all my training aids, or we tend to refer to it as source. That all went back to the sheriff's office, and then it got passed along to a new handler who can now train her dog using the source that I had. But what do we do with that source? We start with a simple procedure called imprinting. This is my dog Zoe when she was a little girl. and she was just learning. And we start with what we call boxes, in which, pretty simple because it's a box. But there is source inside that box. And at the very, very beginning, every time she put her nose on that box like that, I gave her a treat. And then we progress up to her, and there's other boxes. You can't see them, but there's other boxes around, and she has to check each box until she gets to the one with the source in it. And that's where the reward comes from. And we just build upon that. And we move, once they're good at the boxes, you move them to what we call the boards. Then we move them to the yard. Then we move them to the wilderness. And we just, in buildings, we start bringing them into buildings. We start putting it on the cars. And we just build and build and build until the dog becomes very, very proficient at finding human remains. And we also shift from the treats that we used at this very early stage to the toy. And that's when they learn that if they alert on the correct thing, that there is a reward at the end. And you'd be amazed at how important that reward is to those dogs. And so once you get all that, and I guess I should mention too, one of the other important parts is, so yes, we're training them to find human remains. Yes, we're training search dogs to find people. But these dogs have to have phenomenal obedience. Deuce in particular, I spent the entire first year with him working strictly on obedience. They have to be able to drop on a single command, which for me is raising my fist in the air. If I raise my fist in the air, they're supposed to drop to the ground and wait. They have to have a rock solid recall. If I say come, they need to come. And a lot of that has to do with safety, because we want to keep the dog safe. So when we go to take certification tests, they have to have, in some of the tests, they have to have something like a canine good citizen, just to prove that they are socialized enough. They have to be able to pass an obedience test. And so we do all that, including a 3-minute downstay. So if you've ever done a downstay with your dog, these dogs have to hold it for 3 minutes at least. And so we do that, and then we get into the field and we start doing the actual human remains detection. Once you do that, then if you pass your tests, you're now certified to go into the field. And so now we're ready to go. What are we going to do? How do they use that ability to smell? How do they use all that work they've done? And I guess I should add here too. So people say, you said you could find bones. Yes, we can find bones. But what about animal bones? Part of that training involves proofing the dogs off of things that aren't human remains. So if you came to my house, a lot of times you would find animal bones in my yard. Now keep in mind, I live on acreage, so I'm able to, it's not like an urban neighborhood where, people are going to go, what is that lady doing? She's so weird. So there'd be bones out there, and you proof the dogs off of the bones. And in the beginning, they all want to see them because they're dogs. Of course they want to see them, but you say leave it, and pretty soon they understand they're not supposed to touch. So they may come by, touch it quick, but then they're off and going because they go, nope, that's not what I'm looking for. So what are they looking for? So here's a really artistic version of what we do out in the wilderness, and we're using the wind. There's a whole science to it, and trust me, the wind can mess you up, or the wind can be your friend. But we don't work into the wind. We don't work with the wind in our back. And that's because it muddies the water too much. It takes away that refinement they need to get to where the source is. In this little diagram, the red X is the source. We're going to start down at the bottom, and we're going to work across the wind. And that allows the dog to get a better sense of pinpointing where the source, or where the body, whatever we happen to be looking for, where it is. And so working the wind is critically important to success and to setting your dog up to success. This one, you could do a whole day seminar on the wind and how to work it, but that's just kind of the down and dirty version. There's also things like this where they called us in to look for the remains of a woman who had crashed her car off the side of a mountain in Montana. And there was a stream that happened to go down the mountain. So in this instance, because they believe she went off up top, we started at the bottom, and we literally took, there were two teams. We literally went up that stream to the top of the mountain to see if we could find anything. And that's because the water's going to bring it down. I mean, that one's pretty simple, but it's going to bring it down. And so that's why you start and work your way up. But what if, especially for a lot of us riders, where we're going to like bury bodies, how do the dogs pick it up when it's beneath the ground? And there's a few things that can happen here, because the ground can obscure somewhat. Now, if it's a recent burial and the ground's been disturbed, that can allow the scent to come up. That can make it easier for the dogs. There can be natural events. We got called out on one time where a bone had been found after heavy rains and had washed down the side of a mountain. So we had 3 dogs we took in. All 3 dogs said there's stuff here. And we marked it and left, which is normally what happens, by the way. We find what we're supposed to find, we mark it, and then we leave it to law enforcement. In this particular event, there were bones, and the dogs were correct, and the bones got sent to the anthropologist, a forensic anthropologist, who dated them to be 200 to 1,000 years old. Now, how did the dogs find those bones being that old? It's because the weather had disturbed the earth enough that it allowed the scent to come up. If it had not disturbed that earth, chances are nobody would have gotten it. So it does take the scent. The older they are, the scent is lighter, so they're just not going to smell it. Now, those bones, we don't know what happened to them. Chances are they were reinterred, because there's a really good chance they were Native American, so they put them back once they checked everything. Aeration, there's 2 little things that go on here. We had another case where they were doing excavating and dug up a bone, brought us in, and we checked their excavation area, marked where the dogs said there were bones. Here's the world, there were more bones. Again, went to the anthropologist, and they dated those bones to be 50 to 200 years old. But again, the earth was disturbed, which is what brought the scent up and allowed the dogs to be able to find those old bones. There's also aeration. So, and this one can be kind of tricky because it really depends on your jurisdiction and if it's private property and whether you have permission. But if you think there's something there, but it's hard packed, you need to aerate with like a stick or a rod to open that earth up and let the scent come out. And scent will get caught too. So that's another thing. If the scent comes up, it can drop into trees and bushes and stacked wood. And so the dogs will pick up on that. And that's where sometimes failed masking comes in. And I bring that up because we see that in law enforcement, and we train for this too. You have criminals who will try to hide what they do. And so they'll throw, dryer sheets on top of it. They'll pile stuff on top of it. And yeah, it doesn't work. It's sort of back to that plate of spaghetti thing where the dogs can still pick out the individual spots. So, but we do train for that. So I want to talk a little bit about water because it's different. These again are sub-certifications, and Zoe was trained to find from the shoreline, and it's really a lot the same. You'd be surprised that the scent that comes up out of the water. And so in the shoreline, they tend to go back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. But that back and forth starts to narrow until they stop, and you've got a little cone. And the scent will come in from the water as a cone. So once they get to that little narrow, then pretty soon you'll get an alert from them, and they'll say here in Sheri's world, and you have a direction for the recovery teams to go out and look. Beneath the water is a little trickier. Zoe, by the way, loved the water. That was oh yes, loved it. But in the boat, we tend to go, we still run a pattern, but you will see the dog, they tend to sit up in the front of the boats, and they may hang over a little bit. But you'll see a change in behavior in them. With Zoe, if you notice in this picture, her mouth is open a little bit. That would normally tell me that she's starting to catch odor. And then when her nose had twitched, then I knew she had odor, and I would tell our navigator to mark it. And so when you get done marking, you just do a few passes. You normally have almost a little map. And then usually we bring in a second dog and have, go through the same thing. So you can kind of compare the maps, but that gives because we don't do the recovery there. All we're doing is saying, hey, this is what we're seeing. And then the recovery teams take over from there, the divers. But they can be pretty successful on the water too. We train together with all sorts of people. In this one, we're with the aerial unit. We do a lot of cold loads, hot loads, because there's times where we had to put the dogs in the helicopters. Zoe loved the helicopter. Deuce, not so much, but Zoe thought the helicopters were great. Of course, Zoe was game for anything, and Deuce he's a little more discerning. But Zoe's like, you just take me along, I'm with you. So here we were training with the aerial team. We've trained with, sheriff's office, detectives, tribal police, the RCMP trained. We did some forensic bone classes with the RCMP. That was pretty fun. Mountain rescue. And mountain rescue can be really fun because they will load you up in their little roller things and take you down the mountain. So that's pretty fun. But it is good to work together. I've taken Deuce up on the climbing ropes, and it just makes it easier when we're all out there together. Training doesn't stop when you certify, though. That's the one thing that people always say, oh, so now that you're certified, you don't have to do this million hours of searching. And no, it never, ever stops. And in fact, once you certify, and especially when you've been out in the field a few times, you realize there's so much more you don't know. This particular picture, we're in Colorado at one of the body farms. And normally when we're training with little parts. And so we don't often get a chance to train on full bodies. So when we can go to the body farms, it's a unique and incredibly helpful training. And in this instance, you can see we're working a burned car where a body had been in the trunk. And then search and rescue conferences. So like here, you can go to Oregon, you can go to Washington, you can Idaho, Montana. They normally have some advanced seminars, so you can go to those too. And so we do that a lot. It just never stops. And we only deploy through the sheriff's office here. Even Spokane police have to go through the sheriff's office to get us. You think they could just call us, but they can't. And self-deployment is considered very unprofessional because there's no support. When you're on a mission, if your equipment is lost or broken, the sheriff's office will replace it. You are also under the legal protection of the sheriff's office when you are working with them. If you self-deploy, all those things are gone. So it really is frowned on. And if other counties want to use you, so my very first mission after Zoe and I certified the first time was in a different county. It was a couple 100 miles away, but they had to call our office or our Spokane sheriff, ask for us, and then we went. And we do a lot of mutual aid for counties that don't have dogs. When we get a successful mission, what happens? Zoe found a body in that tent. This was at the body farm as well. But what do? I mean, yeah, we're trained in crime scene, we're trained in forensics, we're trained in all of that, but our job is done. The minute she did that, my job was done. I mark it, I call the sheriff, and we go. Now, we do have to debrief, we do have to a lot of times be interviewed if there's a detective involved, and we do have to write a mission report. But our job is done at this point. We have done what we were sent out to do. And so, like I say, we mark it, we call it in, and then we wait for further instructions. And usually those further instructions are return to command post. The world is changing for search teams, though. That's one of the reasons I stepped away. I spent, like I say, over 3 decades working in the judiciary, and I was in and out, I was in the courtrooms all the time because that's just the world I worked in. But I didn't want to be in the courtroom as a witness. And this is why. The canine teams are becoming more and more where they're being called into court. we have shifted from volunteers to unpaid forensic professionals. And that's the way we're looked at now. And in this instance, or in this picture, I'll tell you again, we're at the body farm, and Zoe just found a body in a suitcase. What does it mean? It means the standards are going super high, which I don't have a problem with that, to be honest. They need to be really, really high. You have to adhere to those standards because, like any court case, they will tear you apart if you don't. You shouldn't be out there searching if you're not certified, and it does happen. But again, they're going to tear you to shreds if you are not a certified team. And the result of our work, that you can be called into court. We have to have the documentation we have to have is crazy. I still have everything from the day Clancy started, all the logs, all the training certificates, all we have to have vitas, we have to have notes. All of this stuff comes into play, and it can be requested in any case that we're involved with. So there is a ton involved, and frankly, I got weary. So as much as I like helping my community and as much as I adore working with the dogs, I was tired of courtrooms. And I leave this picture here because this is Max. He is not my dog. He was a member of our team until he crossed the Rainbow Bridge a couple years ago, but we call him Super Max. He was absolutely hands down best dog I've ever seen. He also helped to put 4 people in prison for first-degree murder. But the thing is, they had to go and testify in 4, well, he didn't. His handler had to testify in 4 separate trials. And that's the way HRD is going these days. And now they weren't as accustomed to the dogs a few years ago, but now they're kind of catching on, and defense attorneys are getting like defense attorneys do. So it's just a world I chose not to be in anymore. This is just, again, I just want to reiterate how we all work together. We're not out there by ourselves. They're not out there by ourselves. This is the Forensic Investigation Station in Colorado. They do an absolutely phenomenal canine seminars, and it was a fabulous experience. And I'm going to stop talking, blathering. I don't know if I answer, questions you might have for me, but like I say, I talk fast, and I'm just not sure what else you need from me.
Oh, thanks so much, Sheri. We've got a couple of specific questions in the chat, and just again, inviting folks to put some more in if things have come up.
Okay.
I just wanted to say, as you were chatting, I was imagining the CVs for the dogs, like what they might put on their CV, their disciplines that they have, and the amount of work that they have, and also just thinking about how terrible my cat would be, and why they use dogs instead of cats. Thank goodness. I'm also very impressed by your hardworking gallbladder and your very interesting freezer. And the magnitude of difference between the scent receptors that we have as humans, and what a loss that is when we don't have even those, and what it must be like for dogs to have 300 million. So we do have a couple of okay, we've got another question in the chat. You can put them in the chat. You can put them in the Q&A. I'll find them wherever they are. I wondered, just to start with, if you could talk a little bit about, do you find that you integrate the work that you've done into your stories? And when you're talking to other people about how to integrate, you have such a wealth of knowledge. And this is, of course, specific to this discipline, but generally, how do you find that when you're thinking about your narrative, like what role do those really true details, like what role does the research have, and how do you find that it integrates into your work or into the work of others?
Well, I do have a fair number of dogs. It took me a while to figure out, because they asked me if I do a book with the dogs in it, knowing what I do, but I couldn't quite figure out my paranormal slant. I had to stick with my brand. Once I finally figured it out, it's great. So there's a number of books with dogs in them. But what you're going to find in my books is that you're not going to find huge detail on what the dogs do. And there's one word why, and the attorneys in the group will get this. It's called discoverability, especially when I was still working, because everything we do becomes discoverable. And so I didn't want them picking up a book and going, yeah, but look what you're doing in here if I ended up on the witness stand. So I tend to leave it a little more vague. Now I may be a little bit more now that I'm out of both search and rescue and all that. So I may get to where I do a bit more detail. I mean, there's still some cases I suppose I could get called in on, cases that we worked on. So I'm still a little leery of that. But yeah, I mean, I try to get enough detail. The other handlers will know I was a handler. But, and I've said that to other people. I've read people's books who use search dogs that aren't handlers. And Kendra Elliott is one of them. And her and I talked about it one time. But I said, you know what? You did such a great job of researching those dogs. I know you're not a handler just because I am one, but the only ones that would pick up on that are handlers. You did a fabulous job.
Oh, that's quite a compliment. Well, we've got a couple of, as I was saying, some specific questions. So let's get to those. I'll just say that I'm always fascinated by the language all of our like different work takes, like the way in which you're talking about like what disciplines even mean in for searching. So a couple here, were your dogs on lead or off lead when you were searching?
Most of the time, my dogs are off lead. So there are times where you'll have them on lead, like if we're out in the wilderness, they're off lead. Sometimes if they're searching a car, I might have them on lead. Sometimes I don't. If they're in a room, again, sometimes yes, sometimes no. It just sort of depended on the situation. You have to be really careful when a dog is on lead. That you are not giving them signals. And so, because you can trigger a dog for something that maybe isn't there if you're moving it wrong or you're pulling back. So you really have to have a fine touch with a lead when you're working the dog on lead. But there are definitely instances where you would have them on lead.
And these two are going along with that question as well. How do you mark?
Oh, Mark. So GPS. So I had a Garmin GPS, and the Garmin actually has, like say, it had tracking for me. It has tracking for the dogs. So Zoe or Deuce would have the collar on, but when we're marking, it has to do with me. And so if Deuce or Zoe was giving me an alert, I would say, mark, you just hit the mark and it puts that it marks the GPS coordinate. And so then when you, like say on water, where we're doing several marks, when you get done, you can come back and you pull up that it's kind of like a little map, and you can see the marks, and they all have a GPS coordinate, and that is what you give to like the command post folks, who will then put it on a bigger map and they can see what's going on.
So this question from Cindy, I feel like is related to that. She asks, I'm curious about how canines work in the snow. How different is the search for a missing person or remains in a blizzard or deep snow? So kind of related to water, but and also changing conditions and perhaps the challenge of being able to mark when the weather is literally changing around you or melting around you.
Yeah, marking is always, that's really fairly simple. It's just you have to learn to be really fast at it. When you're first learning, you're all thumbs. But in the snow, it is very different, and weather conditions require you to adjust what you're doing. And so the colder it is, the more the scent sticks to the ground. And so in warm, pleasant weather, those dogs can just take off and run, and they're going to catch it, and they're going to work it through, and they're going to find it. When it's snowy, the scent is held so close to the ground, you've got to slow down, or you're going to end up, or you make multiple passes, because you're not catching it up here. You'll watch the dogs as they go out and their head will come up. But when it's colder, their heads need to be down. And so sometimes that takes a couple of passes to get them to go. But yes, the scent rises and drops depending on the temperature, the ambient temperature. And so snow really keeps it closer. And it makes it harder because you're also looking for visual cues. I mean, you're watching your dog, but you're also watching your environment. Well, in the snow, all you see is one big white blanket a lot of times. So it's a different way to search. Absolutely.
Yeah, thanks for that question, Cindy. This one is feels pretty specific and perhaps beyond the point of the search. So it's can adipocere, a word that I have never said out loud before.
Yeah.
So my first time, can adipocere be reliably tested for DNA and carbon dating?
And I don't know the answer to that. Because that hasn't come up in any of the things we've done. Now, have we searched with adipocere? Yes. Yes. They're trained to detect that. But again, it's one of those things that then goes on. We would find it, mark it, and call in the law enforcement. So, like I say, our work is done upon finding. We don't touchy, we don't feely. And the dogs don't. The dogs find it, the dogs just sit. They're not putting their nose on it. They're going, yep, there it is.
Thanks for that. I'm curious when people, when you were sharing that people come up to you and say, "Oh, my dog's got a great nose," like you would be a great. It reminded me of I'm often having people come up to me and saying, "I've got a manuscript, like the great book that I have in me," and I often sort of give them advice about like where to turn to and what maybe classes to take or places to look for when people do come up to you and say, "My dog's got a great nose," as long as they are perhaps under the age of 3, how do you recommend that they find out more or maybe get involved?
Oh yeah, we just send them to. So we the teams have a person that kind of uh, takes care of that. And so a lot of times you talk to them first and you kind of give them a clue because most people have no clue. I mean, I didn't have any clue how much time it took. I really didn't. But you sort of share some of that information and then say, if you're still interested, go here, talk to this person, and go from there. And then we have a whole packet of information that kind of lays out a lot of what I laid out today, but it gives the detail of exactly what you have to do. And then the testing of the dogs sometimes, because the dogs have to be tested by the sheriff's office, and they will pass or fail them. So that kind of takes care of it pretty quickly too. A lot of
Yeah.
people wash out as soon as they find out the time that's involved. When you explain to them that, they're like, yeah, I can do that. Well, that's the job. And no, you're not getting paid for that job.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's such a commitment, both as you say, you work as a team. So for you and for the dog.
Yeah. Yeah.
This is just an additional question about snow. Being from the Midwest, I appreciate all questions about snow. I know dogs have fur, but how deep can they search? Are you concerned about freezing temps?
Oh,
Do
yeah.
PDs hold off on bringing dogs out in a blizzard and wait for conditions to subside a bit?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, safety first. And you as a handler. I mean, I could show up at a search, look around and say, no, this is not safe for me. This is not safe for my dog. So I will not, you have the right to say that. And so, and other things, I guess, and some I didn't mention, and this is kind of a quirky thing too, is you want to go on a search blind. Okay.
Mm.
So, and I've had this, like our local folks know this, so do the Kootenai people, but sometimes we get called out to small counties that don't have canine teams. And so their folks will come in and say, okay, so I want you to go over here and I want you to look for this. And you stop them and go, no, Give me the area you want me to search in and do not tell me anything else. I need to go into this blind or you are contaminating the search. I can't go in with anything preconceived. And so, yeah.
This question was from someone who came in a bit later, and we are going to be sharing these slides, so all of you will have a way to kind of review the material. But asking about, do dogs you work with also search for drugs? And I know that was kind of the list when you were talking about the different disciplines that dogs are trained for.
No, yeah, and I did mention that earlier. The drug dogs are normally part of the sheriff's department. The search and rescue dogs are part of the volunteer team. The HRD dogs, the avalanche dogs, the life find, all of that. The law enforcement doesn't have enough funding or bandwidth to run all of it. So they have the patrol dogs, they have the drug dogs, and then the search and rescue picks up the slack. Yeah.
Well, I think I'm gonna close us out with a final question, but I just wanted to say that I shared the link for all of the MWA University sessions that happened this summer and fall semester. Calling it a semester, I haven't been in school for a while, but just gets stuck in your mind. In case anyone missed any, and reminder to become a member if you are not already, for all that Mystery Writers has to offer. When you were talking about going in blind, it reminded me of, I was thinking about tying it back to writing. Do you feel like with the books that when you're starting a new book, do you feel like you're going in blind to it? Or do you have, and this is not a plotter pantser question, it's more like, do you feel like something has developed in your mind, or do you like the experience and appreciate going in without an idea of what you might be framing? No pun intended, I guess.
I think maybe I'm kind of consistent because I go in fairly blind. I mean, I have a kind of idea what I'm doing, and I know what the dogs are, and I know, who the main characters are. But sometimes the dogs do things I'm not expecting. A lot of times the people do things I'm not expecting. So yeah, I kind of approach my novels the same way I approach a search. Don't tell me anything, just let it happen.
Excellent. And do your dogs have any favorite scents? Let's not call dead bodies favorite scents. So besides that skill set of theirs, is there anything that they just really love or they would love to find as their noses are working overtime?
And I honestly don't know because I've done no scent work with them other than human remains. So that's kind of their thing. Like I say, Deuce, even though he's out of the field, will still check your car to make sure you don't have any bodies. So, and Zoe would do the same. I mean, I lost her last year, but Zoe would do the same thing. She would check your car just to make sure.
Well, it makes it very safe companions to have around. So
yes, it does.
Thank you as people said, thank you. Great presentation, super informative. Thank you for all that you've had to offer this evening. And a reminder to everyone that Sheri's new book is coming out in just about a month. So you should pre-order or ask for it from your library, and appreciate all of you being here this evening, or whatever time you may be watching this, and wishing you all a good night. Thank you, Sheri.
Thank you.
Okay, bye.